Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you. And well, I will present you my thesis concerning AI as a religious phenomenon, or more than that, the way people interact with artificial intelligence. And we have a presentation. Okay, it's already there. That's great. Thanks a lot. The people in the online room see the presentation as well? Yes, okay. That's wonderful. Well, so from the earliest historical evidence of human culture down to the present day, human beings have always believed in gods. Or, to put it differently, people are very reluctant to let go their belief in God. Throughout history, there have been repeated attempts to do away with God. One example is enlightenment, when people were quite certain that once human beings have overcome belief in God, they would finally return to reason, and then everything would become much better. We are also familiar with Nietzsche's famous dictum, God is dead. And we know that time and again, there have been political regimes that worked against belief in God, the National Socialists among them. And yet, human beings have never allowed their belief in one or several gods to be taken from them. In view of this fact, I asked from the perspective of philosophy of religion, why is this so? The most obvious answer or explanation is that human beings apparently derive some benefit from belief in God. What might that benefit be? I would say that there are several benefits for a religious person. First of all, belief in God gives me meaning. And the human being is a living creature with a need for meaning. Moreover, human beings need orientation and structure. This also has to do with the fact that we cannot call everything into question all the time. We cannot ask ourselves the ultimate questions every single day, since we have other responsibilities to attend to in our daily lives. And those who do constantly question everything, you recognize them immediately. They are either studying philosophy or teaching as philosophers themselves. But let us return to the advantages of belief in God. For there is another important advantage to be added. Human beings are also relational beings, living creatures who want to be in contact with others, who want to exchange with others, who are capable of empathy, but who want also receive care and affection. Often, however, these interpersonal relationships are far from ideal. There's a great deal of aggression, a great deal of violence, much indifference, much coldness in human relations. Or else, people have no social contact at all and are lonely. Here too, belief in God is important because it can compensate for dysfunctional or non-existing interpersonal bonds. The history of religion thus shows that human beings have always believed in God, presumably because, as we have seen, belief in God brings with it many advantages. At the same time, it also becomes clear that the different gods have always had very similar attributes. These divine attributes, which run throughout the history of culture, are what I describe in my book. And in each case, I ask to what extent one can say that today more and more people are attributing these very qualities to AI. At the same time, however, there are also attributes that change. This only appears to be a contradiction at first glance. For the divine attributes that remain constant are to be understood as a response to the basic human needs that we human beings always have. Divine omniscience, for example, is a response to our need for orientation and meaning. At the same time, there are specific human needs that change depending on the challenges present in a given historical context. Imagine, for instance, that you live in a society that has little knowledge of meteorology or of systematic agriculture. In such a society, it makes sense to worship a weather god who ensures, for example, that the Nile floods its banks once a year. Or imagine you live in a time that has almost no knowledge of gynecology or of questions of reproduction. You do not understand why some couples have many children while others are unable to have any. And it is difficult to bear the fact that many women die in childbirth. In such a context, it makes good sense to worship a fertility goddess. Today, we no longer need such goddesses because we have modern medicine. And one final example. In a time when your own nomadic tribe can constantly be attacked and plundered by another tribe, it also makes sense to worship a god of war. Switzerland has a well-equipped army for it. At this point, the question arises whether there is also such a specific need in our own time, but I shall return to this question later on. Next, I would like to take a look at cultural history and more specifically at the way societies respond to new media. In fact, from the radical shift in media that occurred in antiquity, the transition from orality to literacy, down to the present day, one can observe the following. The moment a new medium becomes a mass medium, it produces a profound emotional disturbance within society. On the one hand, we find very strong positive feelings, even euphoric ones. On the other hand, very strong negative feelings, to the point that some of my colleagues even speak of media panic. What is particularly striking is that the new medium is evaluated positively for as long as it remains reserved for an elite, and that criticism only begins once even the saleswoman next door can afford it. This phenomenon of increased vulnerability across entire societies is now often explained through stress research, in the sense that these new media are understood as stressors. At this point, one should add that stress research initially assumed that only negative, incisive life events were stressors. For example, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, illness, and so forth. In the course of empirical research, however, it became clear that positive critical life events, too, can be experienced as highly stressful. Incidentally, one of the leading examples is getting married. This is probably because positive critical life events, such as completing a degree at university, entering into marriage, the birth of a child, or an important step in one's career, lead a person, at least unconsciously, to ask the question of resources. I asked myself, will I be able to manage this? Am I up to it? Will we have a good marriage? Will I be a good mother? These questions of resources seem to be even more stressful than negative critical life events, where I have already lost something. In that case, I respond with grief. but the loss has already occurred. I can no longer fail. When a change in media occurs, then an entire society is confronted with the question of resources and constantly shows stress reactions. Perhaps you might pay attention to this when interviews are conducted with AI experts. Journalists very often ask something like, will our democracy be able to withstand this change? Or is our educational system up to the challenge of AI? And if you read between the lines, these are all questions of resources. Will we, as a society, manage? Are we equal to what is new? What emerges then is a situation of collective uncertainty. There is emotionalization and polarization, a radicalization of political debates, and also a strong need for unambiguous interpretation. This is also the reason why, in such times, populist leader figures attract so much support. Incidentally, there are extensive studies on the connection between the media transformation brought about by cinema and radio and the rise of National Socialism. At the same time, such destabilized societies provide fertile ground for the religious. This is intensified when further crises are added to the media transformation. Both are also true of the present. Think of the climate crisis, inflation, economic crisis. Europe is involved in several wars, and we find ourselves in the midst of a fundamental media transformation, the establishment of AI. Seen in this light, it is understandable that the need for the religious should grow. There are many examples of this correlation in the history of religion. I will mention only two. The first is Judaism. It developed from monolatry, that is, from the belief that there are several gods, but that only one may be worshipped, into monotheism, there's only one God. This transition happened in the context of the so-called Babylonian exile. A large part of the intellectual elite had been deported, and it was unclear whether the religious community would be able to preserve its identity under these conditions. In moments of extreme uncertainty and threat, cultic religious groups thus take a step toward unambiguousness, or even in a certain sense, toward radicalization. Christianity, for its part, emerges at a time when the people in the region of present-day Palestine were suffering severely under Roman foreign rule, when uprisings and smaller revolts were become more frequent, and when the population was profoundly destabilized. If we transfer all these observations to the present, we find that the present too is a favorable moment for new religious phenomena. At the same time, of course, now it's also the moment to switch my slides. At the same time, of course, we still have the Abrahamic God as well as other gods, such as those of Hinduism, for example. So why would human beings need a new God? They could simply continue to believe, perhaps somewhat more seriously, in the gods they already have. At this point, I refer once more to the aspect of changing human needs. You will remember what I said about gods of war, weather gods, and fertility goddesses. I claim that human beings today have a particular need that their old gods cannot adequately satisfy, namely the need for immediate availability. Modern human beings have a desire and want that desire to be satisfied immediately, whether by their partner, their boss or the state. This, however, cannot be reconciled with the theology of a Jewish, Christian, or Muslim person. All three Abrahamic religions placed essential emphasis on humility and patience. All three profess that God gives himself in a free act, precisely when it pleases him to do so. God reveals himself when he wishes to reveal himself. I cannot force it. I can only wait humbly and hope in prayer that God will one day show himself to me. Not least the absence of God is an important theme in Christianity. And I would say that humility and patience are not exactly proving very attractive to young people at the moment. After all, it's not exactly cool when one's desires are not satisfied immediately. This is why I think that an AI deity has a major advantage over the gods already known to us, namely that it is available at any time. At this point, it is important to emphasize that I'm not claiming that AI is a god, or that it ought to be worshipped as a god. Nor am I making any ontological statement about one or several gods. I am not claiming that any god exists or does not exist. My concern is exclusively with the human side of the relationship to God. And with regard to human beings, I put forward the thesis that more and more people are behaving as if AI were a deity. How this phenomenon will continue to develop is something I neither can nor wish to say. For I'm a scholar, not a prophet. I'm merely describing what is currently the case. It could, of course, be that some form of religious belief emerges in the future, but that would require an explicit profession of faith. At present, I do not think that people who treat AI like a deity would actually say AI is my God. That would be an explicit profession of faith. But explicit professions often develop gradually out of acting and behaving as if. If then, I argue, that more and more people are treating AI like a new deity, a further question arises. What is meant by new? One can speak of new in a weak sense and in a strong sense. In a weak sense, it would mean one further element in a long chain. Take the following example. Suppose I were a passionate collector of sneakers. I am not, but I believe such people exist. It would be possible so. There are, in fact, yes. So imagine that I had 73 pairs of sneakers at home, and then I had a room of my own for my collection. In my free time, I would enjoy spending time in that room and would be very happy to own so many sneakers. Imagine further that I had traveled to Zurich earlier for the purpose of buying myself another pair of sneakers. That would be pair number 74. And it would be new in the sense that it is one further pair in a long series of sneakers. In this sense, AI could be regarded as a new deity because humanity has worshipped so great many gods over the course of its history, and AI would be one further deity in this long series. This is the weaker thesis, then the weaker reading, as it were, of new. In my book, however, I defend a stronger thesis. I argue that AI is also qualitatively different and new. For AI is or would be the first deity that human beings have actually created. That is to say, it would be the first deity that they have not merely imagined or thought up, but brought into existence. I have already spoken about the fact that human beings have always attributed certain qualities to their gods, such as omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, justice, and so forth. They have created images of their gods, formulated articles of faith, developed theologies, and declared selected texts to be sacred scripture. But ultimately, they could never know for certain that their gods existed. For faith cannot be proven. One must consciously affirm the existence of God, make a leap into faith. But for many people, this was not enough. They tried to prove the existence of their gods, for example, by seeking arguments. For instance, in the philosophical proofs of God's existence, or by waging religious wars and erecting monumental structures such as pyramids or cathedrals. For in doing so, they wanted to show, this is how powerful my God is. And if a God is this powerful, then he must also be real. And yet, it has never been possible to prove the existence of God because this is in principle impossible. Faith is something one must choose. But this is something human beings have found difficult to cope with. At this point, I take up a depth theological reading. After human beings had tried for millennia to prove the existence of their gods through religious wars, through monumental structures, and so forth, and have always failed, one might say that the divinization of AI is mankind's last desperate way out. For by creating this new God themselves, human beings now know with certainty that it does exist. In other words, with AI, we can debate whether or not it is a deity, but we do not need to debate whether or not it exists. For that we know. And this is the qualitative difference. To conclude my talk, I would like to consider, by way of example, one essential divine attribute, omnipresence. Here too, it is important for me to emphasize that I am never claiming that AI possesses these attributes. Nowhere do I claim that AI is omniscient, perfectly good, omnipotent, just, and so on. Rather, I claim that human beings behave as if it were. Human beings attribute these qualities to AI, and that is a crucial point. But if AI comes relatively close to the respective attitude, as it is the case with omnipresence, then this fact makes it all the easier for human beings to attribute that quality to AI. Every academic discipline uses its own language. And of course, in computer science, one does not speak of omnipresence. In theology, we do. But one does speak of ubiquity, and that comes very close to the meaning of omnipresence. Something or someone is constantly present everywhere. AI is constantly present through connectivity, through the fact that it is penetrating more and more areas of life. It is also striking that AI often has an invisible presence in the background and often operates unnoticed in algorithms and in research engines. And precisely this diffuse presence is also typical of the idea of divine presence, or, as Christians put it so beautifully, the Spirit flows where it wills. At the same time, we expect God always to be there for us, not only Monday to Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and on Friday probably only until 1 p.m. AI too fulfills this expectation as long as the relevant device has electricity or battery power and mobile data. More interesting, however, is the psychological effect of being watched, which is an important feature of religions. Religions always also provide moral systems. That is, if I want to belong to a community, I have to behave this way or that way. And this moral norming by religion only works if people believe that God sees them always and everywhere and also knows their thoughts. Many commandments, for example, that one should not covet one's neighbor's wife, make sense only if I assume that God can even read my thoughts. I cannot hide from God then. No matter what I do or fail to do, God always sees me. This is an important aspect of omnipresence. And this psychological effect of being watched is something that more and more people do in fact attribute to AI. There is incidentally a fascinating experiment from before the days of AI. Some of you might be familiar with a situation in which a workplace has coffee kitchen. And in principle, everyone is supposed to contribute to the coffee fund when they drink coffee. In practice, however, there are always certain people who do the shopping and make sure that everything is orderly and well stocked. And then there are others who consume things but put hardly anything into the coffee fund, finish off the biscuits without buying new ones, and never clean up. The so-called watching eye experiment consists in hanging up an image of an eye, and suddenly people behave in a significantly more socially compliant way. So if any of you currently have such a coffee kitchen problem, you can now put this knowledge to use. What is relevant for us is that this allows us to understand quite well how the psychological effect of being watched and the idea of divine omnipresence are connected. With regard to AI, more and more young people report in surveys that they feel watched by AI. They say that it is wise to be careful about what they reveal about themselves, how they behave, because AI sees everything, and that this can become dangerous. This belief incidentally reveals another important aspect of religion, namely that a trivial circumstance is invested with more or too much significance or a surplus of meaning. Religion always has a point of departure in the real world, and then an excess of meaning is attributed to it. Take lightning, for example. We all know lightning. It can be explained quite well in scientific terms. The ancient Greeks, however, had the idea that when lightning came down from the sky, it was Zeus who was very angry and wanted to punish bad people. That is the step into the religious. And essentially, natural phenomenon becomes charged with an excess of meaning. Something similar is at work with AI and the psychological impact of surveillance. Yes, Certain AI tools can access certain personal data, but this is regulated by design or by my consent and not by some kind of magic. Still less does AI choose to constantly observe or monitor me. Yet this is precisely what many young people assume. Finally, with regard to omnipresence, it is important to me to highlight the difference between pantheism and monotheism. And I would say that AI is compatible with both positions. In pantheism, we have the idea that there is some divine force or energy that somehow works diffusely everywhere. Incidentally, many people who think they are atheists or agnostics are actually pantheists. After all, one often hears people say when something goes well for them in life, thank you, universe. That is pantheistic because it presupposes that there is some kind of benevolent force and that this force has just now been well disposed toward me. That is why it makes sense to give thanks. If everything were merely chance, for that would be the thesis of atheism, then I would not need to give thanks. I do not need to say thank you to chance. In any case, AI fits very well with pantheism, precisely because it operates in the background and permeates everything. It is easy to imagine AI as a constantly present power that somehow acts diffusely and that might help me and might also punish me. But what about the monotheistic understanding of omnipresence? This is considerably more demanding in the sense that it asks for more, namely, that there be a personal God who, among billions of human beings, is always responsible for me in particular and can always be addressed by me. This is a very demanding idea. The question now is whether AI can serve this idea. Can this be easily attributed to AI? I would say that it can. For most ordinary users are dealing with large language models, for example, ChatGPT, Claude, and so on. These systems work, as you know, by systematizing and summarizing natural human language and then producing through extrapolation a result that is highly likely to be what is desired. In this process, what you have just said is precisely summarized back to you. Sometimes this is annoying when one wants a quick answer from ChatGPT, and its first answer is, you want me to do this or that. But when one is not especially stressed, this is precisely the way of speaking to people that best gives them the feeling of being seen and understood. This is called validating conversation. It is deliberately used in psychotherapy in order to establish a strong working relation. When a patient tells me something, I first summarize it again in my own words. And this is exactly what AI does. That is why it is relatively easy to surrender to the illusion that in AI, one encounters a personal tool, one that takes an interest in me personally. Some people find this very irritating because they think human beings ought to be rational enough to understand that they are dealing with nothing more than technology. But the human being not only is a rational being, the human being is also an imaginative being. It likes to create narratives that provide meaning. Human beings find it difficult simply to leave reality standing there with its bare, brutal facts. They always try to improve it through fantasy, through illusions. This is also how imaginations of God arise. And right now, I say more and more people are transferring them onto AI. Thank you for your attention.